Buddha, J. Krishnamurti, was invited to talk at the United Nations, the august body that's there to create peace and bring about, unify the world and so on. And his message to them was, there's no organization on this planet that is going to solve this problem if we as individuals, if humankind are in conflict. And it's a message that actually has been echoed through the ages. And he he rather pointedly told all these august people in this grand body, these international diplomats, that you're useless in terms of solving conflict, because you go home and you're in conflict. You fight with your own wife, you fight with your children, you fight with yourself. One of the seminal works of modern psychiatry in the 1960s was a book by a man called R.D. Laing called The Divided Self. And it really was a very influential work in its time that basically challenged modern psychiatry, which was moving very heavily towards the sort of neurobiological understanding of mental health, by pointing out, he approached it in a sort of phenomenological or existential way, and pointing out that mental illness really was a reflection of the self in conflict with itself. That he focused mainly on severe illnesses like schizophrenia, but his message really spoke to our whole concept of what it is to be mentally well. And that is that when our inner, what you might call your authentic self, your inner self, your private self, is struggling to make a fit with the external world, that you are immediately in conflict. Beyond that, the very structure of the way you see the world and your inner psychic reality can have within it deep conflicts. A very easy way to understand this in yourself is to use the tool that we use in Anthropedia and that I use clinically in Palm, which is the temperament character inventory. It's this, very straightforward tool. It's a self-report personality questionnaire, and we bang on about it all the time, but it's extremely powerful for this kind of self-reflection, because within it you can discover the roots of many different conflicts, which if we cannot find some kind of peace and some kind of healing of our divisions within ourselves, then how can we approach the world, whether it's just within our own families or whether we become part of some august body or some movement to try to bring peace in the world, because it is really only a manifestation of the division and conflict that exists within us, what we see without. Oftentimes, the things that we find most distasteful in other people are reminders of something that we don't want to look at in ourselves. We are in love with our minds. Ever since human consciousness raised to such a level that we are very much aware, able to reflect on our own minds, we've almost been bewitched by it, to the detriment of other parts of ourselves. Where we live in an age now where, and again, this is part of what Anthropedia struggles with all the time, is trying to get people to understand that the mind-body connection is really just a mind-body union. It's one and the same thing. But we live in a world where we have almost lost contact with our bodies. We have become divided in that mind-body connection. Our bodies are sort of dragged around like useless bags that we're kind of stuck with, that we really would rather not have. But we've lost a lot of the connections within our own minds, that we live in a state of conflict within ourselves. And to be able to see that is very hard. We don't want to see that, and our mind will defend against that. We have a sense of self which necessarily needs to be it needs to be fairly coherent. We need to think that we're basically structured in a way that we can trust ourselves. Because if we don't, then we're really at sea. If I can't trust in my own mind, then what can I do? And so our own mind does tend to constantly want us to see ourselves in more flattering ways than perhaps the reality is. And um, and division, which is actually not healthy and really not natural. Um, Division can be something actually we cling to, and we cling to it because change is hard and reality is hard. So we often will cling to some very strongly held belief systems or some very divisive ideas within us, simply because it makes life more convenient for us. It's just, it's just that easy. Life's just easier if you believe this. And so, to echo Krishnamurti, there isn't any organization, there isn't any movement, um, there isn't any kind of coming together of mankind to the benefit of healing division if we can't start with ourselves, if we can't begin, bravely and calmly to reflect uh, on the divisions within.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, Nigel, if you could expand a little bit on, the comment you made that despite the fact that it's not natural, we cling to these divisions, but if you could speak to a little bit how, unity is that natural state. And Kevin, if you want to even hit at that from a more macro level, to the naked eye, we would be led to think that everything is disconnected, but we know science teaches us, quite the contrary. And Nigel, if there's some examples also from an individual point of view within ourselves.
Hmm. Well, I mean, the most obvious one for me is, of course, what I've just said, and that is that there is a unity of the being, right? There is a unity of the mind, the body, the spirit, that it is not, most of our concepts of mental illness reflect the fact that we understand that division um, is at the root of mental ill health. Um, and so we understand that there is no, that there is the reality of what we are is there is no division between the structure, the function, and the existence of this being. And perhaps we can go into that in more concrete terms, but perhaps I'll let Kevin first comment on the other ways in which we know that unity really is just reality.
Yeah, and I saw there's a couple of questions coming in too, so we'll get back to these. Yeah, I think that I think sort of belying everything that we're talking about, right? So we talk about like the mind-body relationship. We talk about how, like again, like Walt Whitman was observing nature, and we see so often, right, that everything in nature is connected, right, in ways that we can almost never expect, right? The plants are communicating to one another, symbiotic relationships are having, but it turns out it becomes even more fundamental than that, right? Scientifically, the more we drive down, like within the physics, our notions of physics and the nature of reality itself, right? We know that there's essentially a field of energy that's giving particles, subatomic particles, mass and things like that. So there, at a very fundamental level, a lot of times in our discourse, we talk about unity as if it's something that we should strive for. But the reality is that unity is the state of the universe, right? Everything is interconnected. Everything comes from everything. Everything is in everything. And that fundamental state of unity is, it's indivisible, right? So the question is not, how do we move towards unity? The question is more, we have to flip it on its head. It's how, because we exist in unity, everything I do to hurt another person hurts me. Everything I do to hurt the planet hurts me. If I hurt myself, I hurt the planet. If I hurt myself, I hurt my community. If I hurt my community, I hurt myself, and so on and so forth, right? And this just spreads from there. And so I think a lot of this work on unity, and we're going to see this in other domains, like, we can talk about this in communication, we can talk about this in education, we can talk about this and just generally in relationships and other domains. The process is one of, how do I remove the things that are leading me to division? How do I remove the agitation or the violence or the problem that prevents me from being aware of the unity which already exists? And if we work from that premise, it's possible to arrive to unity. But if we work from the premise that everything that exists is separate little bits of matter that don't have any connection to one another, it's very difficult to find any way towards real, peace and conflict resolution.
Yeah, and if I can make that very concrete, so if what Kevin's saying is like unity is reality, and we could think of division and disunity as being just a bad dream, really. It's all just a bad trip, a bad creation of our minds. Very concretely, I mean, I talked about severe mental illness, but very concretely in ordinary everyday struggles, when we, for example, when we can't accept our own bodies, when we're aging and we don't like the way we look, or when we are constantly feeling that we are the wrong weight, or when we feel that our own success is more important than the connections that we have with the people that matter to us in life. There's all kinds of small little everyday ways in which we create this conflict or division within ourselves, and you cannot get better at debating or arguing to get out of that. It's not about arguing your way out of it. It is about seeing it, and it's about understanding it. Because as Kevin said, we're not really trying to find our way to unity. We're trying to allow ourselves to let go and go back into the natural state that health exists in.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions, Nigel, that's kind of related to what you're saying right now, is how do you distinguish between inner conflict and, say, a mental illness?
Yeah.
So is mental illness not a disease in that sense of the mind in a medical sense? Is it, or is it a matter of perception, those kinds of stuff? I think it's kind of related to that if you want to address
Yeah, exactly. And it's a great question because, for the phenomenologists, that's exactly it. It's a question of degree of conflict, if you like. So a severe mental illness is, would be present when there is a complete schism between, their identity, their sense of self, and their attempts to exist in the world. Now, of course, I would say that, that's fine at the level of the psychology. The human beings are body, thought, and soul, and so mental illness itself can be a manifestation of a root cause in any one of those three, and this kind of conflict is often more existential, so maybe more spiritual. Sometimes, like I say, it can be very ordinary psychological, like the person who's just fighting against themselves over the way they look, but it can also have roots within the brain. I mean, there are divisions within the brain and the body that create mental illness. So we know that, there is mental illness arising, for example, from a lack of plasticity in the brain, where the different parts of the brain, if you like, cannot coexist peacefully, that one part of the brain is dominating over another. So it's not that mental illness does not exist in the material sense, because it clearly does. We can stick probes into people's brains and we can make those brains work in odd ways that are not healthy. But it is certainly the case that a lot of mental illness could arise purely out of internal conflict. I mean, Freudian psychoanalysis really was born out of Freud's exploration of repressed conflict. And that was kind of a fundamental part of his theory. That, and in his case, it was the fight between the id, the ego, and the superego, fundamental conflicts of our desires versus what is acceptable in society versus what we want for the self. Um, and so again, this is a Freud actually being a neurologist, I think at one point did believe we would find neurophysiological structures representative of those three components of the psyche. But and it may be that we're moving back towards that possibility as neurophysiology starts to sort of fill in some of the gaps. But whether we do or we don't, it's still a valid kind of concept in so much as understanding that conflict is at the heart of a lot of mental ill-being. And again, we come back to this connection to the external. Our personality is a complex dynamic system that is seamlessly connected to the complex dynamic system of the universe that we're in. So as Kevin pointed out earlier, what's happening within you comes back to you sometimes, tenfold. But the good news is when we start to become reflective enough that we can use our free will to change and heal some of the division within us, the same is true of the healing effect, right? What can come back to you? You don't have to. You don't have to be chasing some kind of perfect or idealized version of what you should be. You simply have to be making incremental changes in how you manage, how you relate to the world, and how you relate to yourself, that can be amplified massively and come back to you, again in a way that further promotes your healing. But we cannot ignore this connection between the inner and the outer. It's on a very concrete way. It's like the parent who wants to lecture the child over the breakfast table about not punching people in the playground, and tells little Johnny that it's very important that you don't speak badly to people, and we all have to get along, and then bundles them into the car to drive them to school, and is being cut up by traffic on Route 40, starts screaming and yelling profanities at other drivers. What do you think the child remembers? Does the child remember the little lecture over breakfast, or do they remember the parent in total conflict with the world? There's no way to. We like to think that we can hide behind something, and maybe sort ourselves out and only present ourselves when we're ready. But it doesn't work like that. When you're in the world, you're a model. Somebody's watching you, even if it's just yourself.
For sure. For sure.
I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to acceptance and the role that plays. We've been speaking about the inner and the outer, and so there's obviously self-acceptance that needs to go on when we're examining our own inner conflicts, and then obviously when we're witnessing the external conflicts too, there's an element of acceptance. And so I was wondering if you guys can just kind of speak to that.
Yeah, I can probably take that one. I think reflecting on what Nigel's saying in terms of like the parent who lectures, and if we kind of extrapolate that to one of the problems that we're having right now in modern society, is that we don't have many spaces for true discourse that exist anymore. That we used to call the commons, has essentially been robbed from us. We don't have community spaces where there's big debates of ideas. A lot of the most recent political campaigns that we've seen all over the world have just been devoid of any real debate of any kind of issues or policies or anything like that. But also increasingly the climates within schools and the increasing social vision we're seeing are preventing us from having real dialogue and debate. And part of this is related to that polarization within society. Part of it is just a reflection of the polarization within society, right? It kind of goes both ways. And I think when we start talking about acceptance, right, and this relates, I think, very well to like Gandhian nonviolence, right? So we've been kind of a lot of what we're talking about here when we look at all the great social movements, whether it's Gandhi, whether it's Mandela in South Africa, or wherever we're looking at these, Martin Luther King here in the United States, like those kind of folks. They always started from this idea that, okay, if we're going to change society, if we're going to remove violence that we see around us, well, the first thing we have to do is look inside and try to deal with the violence we have inside of us, to identify that violence. And Gandhi always made that distinction between sort of active violence and passive violence. And active violence is really easy to see because it's externalized, it's aggressive, it's painful, it hurts people, it's obvious. But I think it was Gandhi's grandson who wrote out a list. His grandfather, he said, my grandfather had me do an exercise to write down every act of passive violence I did in a day. And I think he stopped at like 125 or something the first time he tried it. And those constant acts of passive violence, whether that's judgment, intolerance, just any kind of aggression, passive aggression, beating someone up with your own, like your own belief systems and, lack of tolerance, lack of accept. There's just so many different ways in which we do that. And so I think when we look at how do we start to stop these acts of passive violence, right? And that's where, how do we end the conflicts, in other words, right? So because all of these are an act of violence. An act of violence involves a conflict either between two things within us or between the inner and the outer, so another between me and another person or between the individual and the other. And what Gandhi talked a lot about was this need for dynamic acceptance, right? And I think that's the important thing is sometimes it's like, if I accept myself 100% as I am, that can be like a sleeping pill, right? So if I say, I'm just a lazy person, that's just who I am. I just need to accept that. And then that's it. You never make any effort to try to change that. So he developed this concept of dynamic acceptance, which was about balancing the desire to change with the need to accept ourselves as we actually are. And that in any given situation, we have to find a balance between these two things. If you have no desire to change, then it's a sleeping pill. If you're just accepting too much. If you have too much desire to change, then you tend to get sort of perfectionistic, you tend to get judgmental, you tend to get intolerant, you tend to get, you lack empathy or those kinds of things. And so finding this dynamic acceptance is really fundamental. And I think it's also really fundamental to real dialogue, right? Because a lot of times what we're reacting to outside of us are the problems that we see in ourselves. So I see someone acting abhorrently, I reject that because it scares me because of something I have in myself, or I'm judging them because I judge myself. We see this a lot, like with our close relationships or our families, right? We see, you can't escape your parents and your own personality. And if there's things about your parents that you didn't like, it's often because there's things inside you that you're doing exactly what your parents do. And so you don't like that part of yourself, so you don't like them and you judge them and so on and so forth. So I think that the role of acceptance is tricky, and there is no one like recipe, like you should always do this to accept things. It really is about this dynamic acceptance and finding this balance, like on a tightrope. How do we? And each time we need to accept something, it's a little different. That recipe of the desire to change and the willingness to accept is always in constant flux.
And if I could just jump in there, from what Kevin's saying, that if you have the image of this dynamic balance where you're constantly trying to accept but at the same time change, the further upstream from that there is a prerequisite to be able to if you like walk on this tightrope, and that is you have to be calm, and which is another thing that we have just not cultivated in modern life. Quite the opposite. So again, I used to make a frequent joke about myself that I'd had all this higher education and years of residency and training just to tell people to go and lie on a biomat for 20 minutes. My parents are terribly proud of me. What an achievement! But the point is, it is fundamental that what we see in society now is there is such a continual agitation. There is such a continual stirring of the pot that um, you can't possibly find that level of reality. When you can look at yourself with a calm, observing, non-judging reality. And in clinical practice, using the TCI, I mean, self-acceptance is the subtrait of self-directedness that I see all the time. That is at odds with how people will perhaps see themselves. People will see themselves as goal-directed. They mean well. They take responsibility. They're working very hard. But when you dig into it, they find it very hard to accept themselves. It is not easy. It requires you to be very calm. And that is not just a state of mind. That is a state of your physical presence as well.
We have a question here that is on this topic, and I apologize, I had the wrong tab open, and I'll get to the other questions that have been up there shortly, but this one's specifically about what we're speaking of here, which is to accept others. Do you have to first accept yourself? And then it goes on to say, folks seem like they label acts of violence as someone who disagrees with them. And there seems to be a new level of insensitivity, or of sensitivity rather, and that just doesn't seem healthy. So.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is that I think what's happened is we've lost this art of dialogue pretty substantially in our society. That it really feels like it's not okay to disagree about things anymore. That if there's disagreement, whether that's at a political level or it's at the level of how do I raise my children, or if it's about, how do we organize a neighborhood, or, we could look at it all these different levels, right? Political is just one example of this pervasive problem of division right now. But it's also clearly present in our political system. I think what's happened is we don't know how to disagree. We've lost this sort of fundamental respect and dignity with others. So we have to find a way. That's why this idea of unity is so important, right? So if I want to treat someone with dignity and respect, if I look at them as separate from me fundamentally, I can objectify them as a human being. They don't exist as a human being. They just become an object that has ideas which I don't agree with, right? And if we look at this in a pathological sense, right? When people do grotesque acts of violence, they have to objectify. They tend to depersonalize and objectify in order to accomplish that fact, right? And it's sort of similar in that sense that if I work from the premise that we exist fundamentally in a state of unity with everyone, that I'm connected to everyone, even the person that I find the most abhorrent, no matter what, right? Then I have to treat that person with some measure of respect. There has to be some level of dialogue, and that fundamental dignity and respect that I show that person is what makes it possible for almost any sort of dialogue or real conversation or communication to take place, right? So I think there's never an easy answer about how do you resolve conflict, or how do you resolve fundamental disagreements or fundamental differences in values. That's never an easy thing to manage. But one thing is sure, I cannot show anyone tolerance, respect. I can't show anyone tolerance. I can't dialogue with anyone. I can't really communicate with anyone without fundamentally having some respect for that person as a human being, right? So it's got to start from there. And to do that well, I have to also find that within myself, right? So it kind of goes, and I'm not sure if I'm being too abstract, but I hope that's clear. But I think we need more and more to find those parts of ourselves, like Nigel's example of the parent who lectures the kid. So, do as I say, not as I do, right? We need to find and root out in ourselves all the ways in which we're unwilling to question our own beliefs and question our own sense of what reality is, and afford the dignity and respect to someone else in front of me as a human being, and then start to communicate about the whole purpose of dialogue is to move to an understanding of truth beyond our two individual subjective perspectives on the world, right? And, you know, in the Hegelian sense, there was this dialectic of like, you know, one thing, one thesis and its absolute antithesis should lead to a resolution, which leads to a new thesis, which leads to a new antithesis, which leads to a new synthesis, and so on and so forth, right? And that's been the history of human thought and the development of culture and civilization for millennia, right? And so that disagreement, like fundamental disagreements, are important actually for the development of human knowledge and human culture and human civilization. So we've always had deep disagreements about fundamental things in reality. You had Plato living at the same time that you had the Greek skeptics who believed there was absolutely nothing real in the world. And you had Plato at the same time saying there's only this reality, and we're not even sure that what I can see with my eyes is that reality. You know, and these two things were cohabitating at the same time in ancient Greece. So that's nothing new. The only thing that's changed in our discourse, I'd say, over the last 50 years or so is we've lost this capacity recently to just have genuine dialogue, and there's been a loss of respect and fundamental dignity. And, you know, we could go on for hours about the causes of that. But I think what's important to start with is accepting the fact that no one person knows the truth with a capital T, right? And that it's going to take a village of people who are understanding of their own limitations and the own limitations of their knowledge to come to some agreement about what the truth is. And that's what I think, that art of dialogue is what we really need to work on again.
Can I pick up from there in terms of psychology? Because, you know, again, as Kevin's saying, there's no one person is the arbiter of the truth. There is truth flying around all over the place, and what each of us has to contend with is an outlook that is filtering everything in such a way that none of us is going to be fully in contact with reality, and we have to develop a greater sense of humility about that. What are we defending when we are so worried about, you know, ambiguity and ambivalence and uncertainty? We have to learn to live with those. It's okay that people see things differently. It's okay, you know, that people cannot get to the same set of facts. In so much as if we are able to, if we are able to, you know, to not feel the need to expend energy defending ourselves on that. What are we defending when we're trying to be right? When we so want to be right? Well, you know, ultimately we're defending this idea of ourselves, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that we have this idea of ourselves. It's very painful and very complicated to start looking at the reality of that. So we'd like a simple explanation. We'd like a simple concept of ourselves. And when that concept of ourselves, which includes, you know, I know what I know, and I'm basic, and I'm willing to concede some things, but I'm basically right on other things. What we're defending is just this psychological idea of ourselves. You know, there's nothing really at stake. You know, I mean, if you come to see me in my office, and, you know, as I sort of say goodbye and open the door for you, a fly comes between us, and I go like that, and I narrowly miss hitting you in the face, you'll probably duck out of the way. And for a moment, you'll think, you know, I was trying to hit you, I was trying to attack you. And then you'll realize that I'm actually a nice guy and I'm not trying to hit anyone, and we'll laugh about it. You know, what you won't do, hopefully, is, you know, duck out of the way, then, you know, knee me in the groin, get me on the floor, put me in an arm lock and start beating my head. But if I were to say something that were to wound your ego,
yeah,
that is exactly how you would react. You know, you wouldn't just, everybody naturally flinches when something wounds our ego. I mean, that, you know, that's just an awareness that our concept of self has been shaken. But instead of seeing that as something that we can look at and we can learn from, we react. And often we react in such extreme ways where we metaphorically do knee people in the groin and put them in an arm lock and put them, as Kevin was saying, all the sort of non-overt aggression that we use to get back at people, but to defend ourselves. There is a very primitive but quite common form of defense that the psychologists in the audience will be familiar with, that we refer to as splitting. And people who struggle on a very basic level, struggle with this, with the messiness of who we are, with dealing with the fact that we're not all perfect. We are flawed. We are often wrong. We are right at some scale, but if you scale up a bit, we're no longer right anymore if you look at it from a different perspective. And some people really struggle with that. They really want to be, irreproachable. And splitting is a very primitive kind of defense where the world is just divided into the good and the bad. And depending on how you interact with me, you're either going to become one of the good folks or one of the bad folks, and there's nothing in between. And again, this is a direct correlate to what Kevin was saying about how we've lost this art of dialogue and dialectic, that we have, it's been reduced to a shouting match. And that's exactly how we're starting to see the world. 20 years ago, I don't want to overcomplicate it here, but that is a defense that you see in a lot of people struggling with what we call borderline personalities, where there's the personality is really fragile and could appear psychotic from some angles, could appear just very neurotic from others. And 20 years or so ago, I would have said that that was a fairly it was a distinct minority of problems that you encountered in psychiatric practice. I was totally unprepared for the fact that today I would say that it's almost gone so beyond psychopathology that it is actually cultural now. That to see things in a black and white way, in an all good or all bad way, is almost culturally endorsed. And this is not, it is not possible to be a coherent human being and live like that. You have to accept that we are constantly in flux, that we are constantly wrong, and it's okay. And we are constantly at odds with the world, and it's okay. And it is not the lack of agreement, it is what we are doing in our refusal to accept ambiguity and ambivalence and uncertainty and disagreement.
Yeah.
So as we kind of head here into the last 10 or so minutes of the talk, it's interesting to shift a little bit more towards, what can we do about this? What are some solutions to everything we're facing? And there are a few questions here that you might be able to touch on them in your response to kind of where do we go from here. And a lot of them, there are 3 or 4 of them that kind of revolve around the theme of, when interacting with others, for example, if we don't share the same set of facts, how do we maintain unity? If there's this deep division between loved ones, if one of them is working on this deep awareness and acceptance, is that enough to kind of transform the interaction? And then even more concretely, what are some even practical ways to promote conversations that are based in dignity and respect? So it was kind of a thematic thing, if you guys want to touch on that, but then also kind of generally bring us into this bigger question of, yes, we know that we're conflicted and divided and the world is, and now what,
Well, I can say very easily to one of those questions, we've never shared the same set of facts. There are 8 billion people on the planet currently, or nearly 8 billion, or maybe just over 8 billion. And those are 8 billion views of the world. The outlook is one of the most unique aspects of human beings. We share so many things. We are, human beings are so similar on so many levels, but our outlook is very unique because it is this complex dynamic process of our personality interacting with the world, and our cultural background and what we're exposed to. So, fundamentally, we've never shared the same set of facts, and and if you think that's a problem, then now okay. I'm being a bit facetious here because obviously people would say, well, there are some things we have to agree. Well, of course there are,
Yeah.
and you will find that those are things where we have systems in place where we just agree. We just alight on even in physics, physics is predicated on these things called the constants. And half of them are not constant. They're not facts in the way that the physicists want you to believe they are. They have to get together in Geneva or somewhere every 10 years. I mean, what is it? The gravitational constant? They're still kind of like
Yeah.
changing it, or, they're debating it. It's different this year than it was.
Yeah.
You know, Again, to get back to what Kevin was saying about Plato and, how we're observing the world, you know, when when people say I know what I know, you got to you got to question, well, how do they know that? Well, they know it through a process that is invisible to them most of the time, which is their own outlook. So the outlook is gloriously varied. We've never been handling the same facts, and yet somehow the miracle of human community, we can move forward together. We don't have to be, we don't have to see things exactly the same way.
If I could just build on that, yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about when we talk about the scientific mind, right? Like, what is the mind of a scientist? Like, what are they actually doing, right? They're generally people that are a little bit more skeptical about how to gather information. Like what kind of information should I trust or not trust? That kind of thing, right? And one of the problems, one of the things that we've seen consistently, so like Nigel was talking about in the context of like psychiatry and dealing with people with that are struggling with mental health problems in the world of coaching, like sometimes I've said this like overtly in some of our trainings and our coaching. I really look at coaching a lot of times as kind of an active, like it's sort of like an active nonviolence, like a la Gandhi here, because in the sense that one of the things that Gandhi talked a lot about was that ending that conflict within yourself and being very self-aware and understanding your bias and your prejudice. It's not necessarily about completely transcending it, because that's a lifetime of work, if you can even do it in a lifetime, to be honest. I mean, I think it's an endless work, right? So you can't fully transcend all your bias like this, it's just not even possible, I don't think. But I think that you can become so aware of your bias that you can check it, that you can say, that is my bias, let me try to listen now. and when you do that, so a lot of what we do in coaching is someone comes with a lot of internal conflict, right? Like they're very unsatisfied in a relationship, for example, or they don't find any meaning in work, and so they have a lot of negative cognitions. They have a lot of like narratives of separateness and division and lack of meaning and lack of purpose. And so a lot of what a coach is doing is actually just bringing peace into that space. In other words, coming in and passively resisting that negativity and violence within that person, right? So what they do is they use love, they use kindness, they use empathy and compassion and patience and every other sort of inborn innate human virtue that we have, right? To just resist the forces of fear, the forces of pride, the forces of excessive desire, the forces of, maybe it's greed, maybe it's, gluttony or whatever else, right? To just give that person a chance to actually observe that thing for what it is. Do you know what I mean? In dialogue with a human being who cares about them, respects them, trusts them, all those things, right? And this is going to go a bit philosophical, and I'll try to be very concise about it because we don't have much time, but all of sort of like what's generally referred to as the perennial philosophy, so going all the way back to kind of Plato, Pythagoras, moving all the way forward to like, say, Spinoza and later philosophers in that tradition, all talked a lot about how do we gather knowledge, like what knowledge is of most worth, what do I know is worth something and not worth something. And what they all agreed on universally was that our senses constantly trick us, and that our beliefs and our opinions are often based purely on things that are false, that are based on, sensations that we can't trust, observations or beliefs that we've just absorbed and swallowed from external authorities. And we shouldn't trust those things. So what was their response? Well, their response was, you have to use reason and you have to use your intuition and listen to your inner voice to get beyond a superficial level of understanding of any problem, right? But you can't really do that without finding some peace and calmness within yourself, and then approaching. So, like, say it's like this person that you're in great disagreement with, like within your family. Part of the problem is you love that person, and the things that they may be valuing you don't value in the same way, and so there's tension that's created from that. But what you're really suffering from is like either a fear of like losing that relationship, for example, or so often it's these sort of conflicts that we get into within our internal narratives, our own sense of self, that conflict with who we think of this person should be or what we want them to be. And then that prevents us from being calm, from being loving, from being respectful, and so we can't ever resolve the conflict. And so we just avoid it, right? And then that hurts us too. And then the problem gets worse, So I think it's really about understanding that we always have a choice, right? About how we approach things and about how we get information that can help us to help others, right? And the ones that we know almost never work, right, are rapid judgments of other people, right? Trying to convince someone of something that we believe, trying, to force our own opinions and ideas on them. These are all things that we teach people in like nonviolent communication to never do, is to rather try to put yourself in the other person's place, understand their perspective, understand how that relates to things that they need or want in their lives. And then to allow reason, to allow the inner voice, to the force of love, the force of truth to express itself in that conversation. If that can happen, all things are possible. People can see all kinds of silliness that they wouldn't otherwise see. But if we don't set a model, that's like, it goes back to what Nigel was saying a long time ago in this conversation, right? If we aren't modeling, if we're not being the change, right? If we don't model the love, the compassion, the tolerance, the empathy, the understanding that we want to see from another person, and we find their values so abhorrent that we're unable to tolerate them, then we don't actually believe in what we think we do. We're also trapped in our own beliefs. And that's the problem, right? Fundamentally, it's actually a question of action. And that's why, so like Gandhi in nonviolence, he called it satyagraha, right? Which was literally, it's like truth force or love force. It's like using the force of truth and love to help someone grow. And I think in many ways, good coaching, good therapy, the kinds of work that we're doing in our programs for like burnout and other things, what we're trying to do is create an atmosphere of love, trust, dignity, respect, and understanding. And it's just amazing what happens in an environment where someone feels loved, trusted, respected, without exception, no matter what can happen, the power of that. And I think we've forgotten that. I think the world is just too full of hate and fear right now. But it's like that force of that is like a candle. It's very small, but it's almost inextinguishable when it's lit, and I think we have to try to renew our own faith in the possibility, even if it will take us a long time to achieve what we want. We're never going to get where we want through those acts of violence and intolerance and narcissism and self-importance. No matter how much truth we think we have in our mind, that means it's like somebody who chews with their mouth open, trying to show someone respect at a dinner, right? You need to show some level of manners to show respect to somebody. It's maybe necessary but not sufficient. So there's some like basic level of respect and dignity that needs to be there, but then there needs to be more, and that more is what I think. if you're here tonight having this conversation with us, then it's that you're searching for that path,
Right.
of I guess love and truth, as Gandhi would have put it.
And
And
I think, okay,
no,
go
I
ahead.
was just going to add very quickly, and it will necessarily be done in the context uh, of these different outlooks. I mean, I have extreme examples of this all the time in my job because, I mean, just this week I was dealing with a situation of someone who is a very devout religious person who became, so religious and so concerned that they were possibly hallucinating and possibly hearing things, and you cannot simply approach that as if there is a truth that I have access to that they don't have access to. You have to enter into a kind of extreme state of empathy where you can stay very much grounded in yourself while at the same time try to understand the other person. Um, and and it's just an extreme example of what we're all actually trying to do all the time, but also to get back to the point about inner conflict, trying to do for ourselves too, because there are these same, quite violent conversations going on within ourselves. And we got a little bit away from the question you asked, which was about practical solutions. Again, for me, Kevin mentioned the burnout recovery program. I mean, that is a program that's predicated on the fundamental importance of being able to calm the body and calm the mind, which leads to a much deeper level of observation, self-acceptance, which naturally allows awareness to spontaneously arise in that circumstance. So, if you do nothing else in a situation where you feel there is deep division, get calm. Be the person that gets calm in the situation. Winding ourselves up further and further is never, ever the answer.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, we are
Out of time.
at the top of the hour, past the top of the hour, and I apologize. Some of the questions remain unanswered, but there's a question someone brought up earlier that kind of segues nicely into this and leads to a nice conclusion, which is, Nigel was speaking earlier about ease and convenience and how like society and media promote ease and comfort and being happy and lack of struggle, but then they're saying, but that's life. Right. So how do we expose that the struggle is worth it? Or in other words, how do we, expose or model that the effort, the hard work that might go into working on our inner conflict and asking the hard questions and really trying to change ourselves from within as a way to help, change our communities and improve them. That is the work of Anthropedia, so how do we expose that? Well, that's what we've been working, about 20 years or so now to do. And that's one thing about our approaches. Those of you who've been through our trainings or coaching or whatever it might be, that we don't have any quick fixes or gimmicks. It really is all about doing that hard work, but ultimately that's what makes us happy. That's what's satisfying, and that's what leads to that real transformation. So, Steve, I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but that really is what we do. I don't know if there's a short answer to that question. And so if anyone here is interested in like diving deeply into that work that we've been talking about, looking at this inner conflict, we have a lot of different opportunities. One that Nigel and Kevin were just speaking about, our global burnout recovery program, which is a more intensive 6-day thing. But we also have one-on-one coaching that you can do, or if you want to become a coach or just do the training for your own well-being, we have an intensive, rigorous well-being coach certification program that's board certified. And if you kind of just want to dip your toes into something, there's the TCI, which Nigel was speaking about, the personality assessment. If you really want to take a good hard look in the mirror at what some of your internal conflicts are and get language with which to speak about that and learn about that, that's a really nice way to get started too. So there's a lot we can do, because I think the other challenging thing in these times is when we sense all of this societal division, we can despair and feel powerless. And I hope if you walk away with, just a few things tonight, I hope one of them is that there's a tremendous amount, a never-ending amount of things you can do, a lifelong of work you can do to minimize that division within yourself and the world around you. And so if you want to know how you can work with us or we can help you, um, you can reach out to us and we'll help you figure out how to do that. But we're definitely over now. But before we part ways, Nigel, Kevin, do either of you have any parting words to share with people before we hop off?
Well, I would just echo from that question that, yeah, it is hard when all around you you're being sold division. All around you you're being sold some kind of division. It is hard. Um, but, we can't wait for outside authorities to stop selling as division. What we can do is choose not to accept it, not to accept the way of separation and disunity. And as overwhelmingly daunting as that may be, as Linda just pointed out, there are just very simple ways we can start down that path. And it's incredibly satisfying to do that. And it just starts with saying, yeah, I'm just not going to accept this. I'm not going to accept that the answer is division and disunity. I'm going to try something else. And that is the beginning of a journey for all of us, which I guarantee you will be a journey of better health mentally and physically, um, and will only lead to interesting things.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to leave it. Amen to that. So
Okay,
thanks everybody.
everybody.
We're seeing, good to see everybody that came out tonight. Thanks to, we get a lot of thanks in here in the chat here. So thanks, Di. We'll definitely pass on your regards. Thanks, Teresa. Thanks, Faye. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Osha. Thanks, Melody, Peter, Tia, Amy, and everyone.
And thank you to everybody, and stay tuned for future offerings of the forum, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good night. All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.